HP Lion Pride P10. The first morning of the Christmas holiday, Harry and Daphne met for breakfast in the Great Hall, and saw exactly how empty the school had become. There were exactly 3 other students left in the castle, all of them from Ravenclaw, and all of them 4th years. Deciding that they truly wished to enjoy as much of the holiday as possible, the 2 teens made it a point to finish up all of their homework, which, as it turned out, was quite easy to do. Harry silently thanked whatever deity had created Hermione Granger, as she had managed to keep them all up to date with their work. By dinner that first night, they had nothing to do but enjoy their time together. "It's so quiet in the common room," Daphne sighed. "It's actually a little scary. I don't think I've ever seen the Gryffindor common room so empty." "Can I see it?" Daphne asked, looking suddenly excited. "I've never seen any of the other common rooms, and you told me that you'd seen ours before." Harry shrugged, and began leading her up to Gryffindor Tower. He gave the password and, with Daphne right behind him, lead her into his common room. Daphne took in the decor and furniture, actually a bit disappointed, as it seemed to be so similar to her own common room. What did capture her attention was the window looking out onto the grounds. "Wow, it's so peaceful looking. Like a painting or something," she sighed. "Looks like Hagrid's got a nice fire going on tonight. I just hope he's not trying to hatch another dragon egg." Harry chuckled. "What?" Daphne asked, shocked. Harry told the tale of Norbert the dragon from his first year, while Daphne listened enraptured by the story. "I heard in 4th year that Norbert is actually called Norberta, and has had a couple of babies. Hagrid really wants to go visit her one day. I hope he gets the chance. I still can't believe it. Although, if anyone could handle a dragon, I bet it would be Hagrid. I mean, hippogriffs, blast-ended scroots." Daphne gave a small shudder. "Thestrals. Still not used to them, huh?" Harry asked. Daphne and Hermione both had found that they were now able to see the spectral horses a week after Millicent had died. And both of them were having trouble adjusting to the fact they had seen someone die. "I know they're harmless and all. I still think that one wants to be your personal pet." Daphne gave a weak smile, and Harry ran his hand through his hair at the memory of their last visit to Hogsmeade. Ever since 5th year, one Thestral seemed to have grown quite fond of Harry, and had gotten out of the line of waiting carriages to say hello, as it were. It had caused quite a mess, as the carriage had gotten its wheels caught with another and Hagrid had to come sort it out. But it's still so off-putting. Daphne finished, turning away from the window and going towards one of the sofas in front of the fire. She sat down, and Harry joined her a moment later. "This is really nice." Daphne smiled as she snuggled into Harry's shoulder. She curled her legs up under her, and Harry wrapped his arms around her. Daphne couldn't help but let out a contented sigh. "It really is," Harry agreed. "Usually there's tons of people around. Everyone shouting to be heard," Daphne added. "Throwing things at each other, making messes. Bunch of heathens, the lot of them." Daphne chuckled. They lapsed into silence for a bit, simply enjoying the company of the other. Daphne tilted her head up and kissed Harry's jawline. He responded by taking her cheek in his hand and kissing her very softly. Daphne slowly ran her hands over his chest and up around his neck, deepening the kiss. Daphne felt the butterflies in her stomach. She had been dreaming and hoping and wishing and praying for this. She wanted to ravage her boyfriend. Her body was screaming for attention. They had barely had any time to just be 2 young lovers. With all their schoolwork, and training, not to mention Harry's private lessons and Quidditch, it was so tough to get time together just to talk, but somehow they had managed. but now, they were alone, and there were no demands on their time. It was long past time to make their relationship more physical. Daphne slipped up and maneuvered herself into Harry's lap, barely breaking their kiss. Slowly, wanting to savor every touch, Daphne slipped her hands under his robe, pulling it off his shoulders. Harry, for his part, shuffled his arms out of the offending piece of clothing and wrapped his arms around Daphne once again. However, that was as far as things were allowed to progress, as Professor McGonagall entered the common room at that moment. Daphne practically leapt across the common room as the Transfiguration teacher cleared her throat. Her face felt like it was on fire, and she could see that Harry looked just as embarrassed as she felt. While it is not against the rules for you to visit the common room of another house, I would very much like it if you at least abided by curfew. Ms. Greengrass, it is getting very late. I shall escort you back to your house. Daphne could only nod and began to follow McGonagall out of the Gryffindor common room, leaving a slightly frustrated Harry behind. He had to take a very long cold shower before he felt calm enough to go to sleep. Daphne could not ever remember feeling so embarrassed in all her life. The entire way back to the Slytherin common room, McGonagall kept up a long tirade about how natural it was to feel certain things with a boy, and that while it was her choice to allow things to progress in whatever way she wished, that the professor hoped she would at least be responsible and take precautions. Daphne could only nod in mortification and occasionally agree with the Transfiguration teacher. Once she was back in her common room, Daphne wondered if there was some sort of ward that alerted McGonagall to Daphne and Harry's situation and allowed her to come in before things had gotten more interesting. Sulking in a chair before the fire, Daphne decided that before break was over, she and Harry would have had some real intimate time. All she needed to do was find a place that would allow them to be together, safe from teachers and comfortable at the same time. She was not about to allow Harry's hands to wander her body in a broom cupboard, for the love of Morgana. The trouble was that they were in a school, and that left very few options open to them. Other than Slytherin, or Gryffindor House, Daphne couldn't think of any place. And after McGonagall interrupted, Daphne shivered to think what Snape would do. Then it hit her like a lightning bolt. There was one place in the whole school that could be exactly what she needed. Daphne stood up and headed to bed. Tomorrow before breakfast, she was going to go to the room of requirement and test it out to make sure it fit her needs. After all, she still had 2 weeks with Harry and she planned to make the most of it. Good morning, Harry, and Daphne. Albus Dumbledore smiled as he approached the two teens. If you are willing, I would very much like it if we could go to the Chamber of Secrets this morning. Harry looked up at the old headmaster and nodded. He had been waiting for Dumbledore to ask, as it was Dumbledore's theory that Voldemort had hidden one of his Horcruxes within the castle walls. Dumbledore had not wanted to search the castle while all the students were around in case it might reach Voldemort's ears, and they needed to keep it quiet. Or the Dark Lord might retrieve and move his soul anchors. We can go right now, sir. I'm finished, Harry said as he stood. Daphne also stood and Dumbledore smiled. Very well, please lead the way. They walked quickly to Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, where the perpetually morose ghost was whining about her fate as they entered. Truly ingenious, Dumbledore said as they approached the sink which served as the entrance to the fabled chamber. To hide the entrance right where no one would ever suspect it to be. Dumbledore smiled, and motioned that Harry should unlock the entrance. Harry spoke in Parseltongue, which he noticed made Daphne shiver slightly, and the sink began to move, revealing the entrance to the long dark tunnel down into the depths of Hogwarts. I should warn you, sir, it's quite disgusting down there, Harry said, wrinkling his nose. Dumbledore nodded, bright blue eyes twinkling merrily. I can already smell what you mean, Harry. Nevertheless, Dumbledore didn't hesitate as he stepped into the entrance and allowed gravity to take him down into the great chamber of Salazar Slytherin. Harry went next, and Daphne followed her boyfriend, grumbling about people interfering with her plans. Nothing had changed. The cavern which led to the chamber was still just as dank and dark as it had been on each of Harry's previous visits. Dumbledore seemed to be enjoying himself, and Harry didn't think he could blame the man. It was likely one of the few places in Hogwarts he'd had never seen before. After a short walk they came to the actual chamber itself. Harry once again asked the door to open, and Dumbledore marveled at the serpents on the door which acted as locks. Dumbledore's face changed the moment they entered the chamber and were assaulted by the foul stink of decay. "The basilisk, I take it?" Dumbledore asked, not even looking at Harry or Daphne. The old man retrieved his wand, and cast a very powerful air-cleansing charm. Harry and Daphne took to lighting the torches that were set into the wall, and in a few moments, Dumbledore was devastatingly disappointed to see the fabled Chamber of Secrets. "I had expected more," he admitted. "I'm afraid there was only one secret here, sir, and I killed it." Harry shrugged. Dumbledore walked the length of the chamber in stoic silence while Daphne and Harry leaned up against one wall. Harry guessed that Dumbledore might be attempting to feel any traces of Voldemort's magic, as he would have been the last one to actually perform any spells in there. Harry couldn't remember if he had cast anything at the ghost of Tom Riddle, though he was quite certain he had not, as he was far too concerned with Ginny's condition at the time. They watched in silence as Dumbledore cast several different revealing spells and was rewarded with nothing. "I was certain that he might have hidden a Horcrux here," Dumbledore said when he finally rejoined the teens. "Sir, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think there might be one other place in the school that might be," Harry said, standing up. "Do you know the Room of Requirement?" Dumbledore's eyes lit up again and a small smile broke out on his withered face. "It is where you held the secret meetings last year, if I am not mistaken." "It is. I've heard a lot of people have found it, but were unable to find it again. Even fewer people know of its existence at all. It's very possible that Voldemort found it while he was here, and thought he was the only one who could find it again." "That does make sense." Daphne nodded, not liking that Harry was about to reveal the location of what was supposed to be their getaway within the castle. It was true she had yet to reveal her plan to Harry, but still, it did kind of irk her. "I think it would be wise to investigate." Dumbledore smiled, and began leading the two teens back into the castle. 20 minutes later, Harry was making his third pass in front of the blank stretch of wall that hid the Room of Requirement. Concentrating on finding Tom Riddle's Horcrux, Harry turned to find that no door had formed. Harry stared at the wall for a moment, trying to figure out why the room had not formed. "Perhaps you were being too specific," Dumbledore suggested. "It is possible that the room cannot even tell what a Horcrux is." "So what should I ask for?" Harry asked, looking between Daphne and Dumbledore. "Why not just ask for a place where hidden things are?" Daphne shrugged. "I mean, how many things could be hidden in there, right?" Daphne nearly fainted when she got the answer to her question a moment later. The room had taken on the size of a small cathedral, piled to the rafters with books, rusty and burnt cauldrons, dirty, moldy clothing, empty vials. Every kind of banned object imaginable, as well loads of garbage. "I'm thinking Voldemort wasn't the only one to try and hide something here," Harry quipped. "Less than you imagined?" he asked, looking at Daphne, who gave him a very dirty look and smacked his shoulder. "Thankfully, I do not think we will have to go through every single item." Dumbledore smiled confidently. "Perhaps, Harry, if you would concentrate and ask the room to remove anything not enhanced magically." Harry looked questioningly at the headmaster, who nodded back. Harry closed his eyes, and repeated in his head for anything not charmed, cursed, or hexed to disappear. "Ah, very well done, Harry." Dumbledore smiled, and gave a soft pat on Harry's shoulder. Harry opened his eyes and saw, that while still crammed with stuff, most of the refuse had disappeared. "At least we can walk about in here," Daphne remarked as she started off. "Yes, however, I would advise both of you to not touch anything." Harry and Daphne nodded, both remembering Millicent as they began trekking into the room. "This stuff must have been piling up since the Founders," Daphne remarked, pausing to examine a very ancient-looking set of scales, which were moving on their own. "Sure," Harry agreed. "You've done something and need to hide the evidence and the room appears. The trouble is, you can't find it again to retrieve whatever it was you dumped in here. I bet the twins would love to get the hands on some of this stuff. Oh, I don't even want to think about what they might do with anything in here." Daphne shuddered. They moved deeper into the room, neither of them even knowing what they were looking for. Harry was trying to sense Voldemort's magic, but there were so many different spells, and traces of magic, he found it truly hard to concentrate. "Hey, Harry, look at this," Daphne said. Harry saw she was standing before a marble bust of a rather horrible-looking warlock with a very old and dusty wig on top of his head. "He's truly ugly," Harry remarked. "Look what he's wearing," Daphne said, pointing to a rather tarnished-looking tiara, tangle in the wig. "What about it?" Harry asked, feeling confused. "I told you how my mother was a Ravenclaw, and that she wrote a biography of Rowena Ravenclaw once." "Yeah, I remember," Harry said, still not knowing where Daphne was going with this. "That tiara looks like Ravenclaw's lost diadem. I've seen paintings of head she always wore a tiara that looked like that. It was supposed to grant vast knowledge to the wearer." Harry, feeling intrigued, stepped a bit closer to inspect the battered-looking crown. Why would anyone hide such a valuable? Harry suddenly felt a surge of hate and coldness that washed over him as if someone had just doused him in freezing water. Professor Dumbledore. Half an hour later, Harry and Daphne stood in Dumbledore's office with the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw sitting on the headmaster's desk. While the old man retrieved the sword of Godric Gryffindor from its case upon the wall. "I am still amazed that you were able to feel Voldemort's magic, Harry," Daphne said, clutching his arm. "It's so. Well, it's amazing and disgusting at the same time. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, but Dumbledore made me swear," Harry said apologetically. "As I must ask you to do as well," Dumbledore said as he rejoined them. "It is imperative that as you all get stronger that your enemies are unaware of all you learn and master." Daphne nodded, fully understanding what was at stake here. Dumbledore, pleased that he had made his point, handed the hilt of the sword to Harry, who looked shocked. "Sir Harry, you have faced so many dangers, and done things wizards twice your age will never hope to accomplish. As much as neither of us wish to admit it, you are at the very center of this war, so it only makes sense that it is you who destroys any further Horcruxes we discover. Simply cut the diadem in two, and it will destroy it." Daphne remembered when Dumbledore had destroyed that goblet Horcrux he had made from the piece of Voldemort's soul that had been hidden inside Harry for 15 years. It had been awful to witness, and given her bad dreams for a month. Yet, this time felt different. This was a step in defeating the most feared wizard in history and a step in Harry reclaiming a life that was by all rights his own. Harry grasped the sword, and looked at Daphne, who smiled proudly at her boyfriend before kissing him gently and then taking a step back. Harry noticed that Dumbledore did the same as well. Harry tightened his grip on the sword's jeweled hilt and raised it in the air. He looked at the diadem, which had begun to shake, and then he heard it. The cold, high, cruel voice of his enemy. Lord Voldemort's voice. They will all die. You will be alone, surrounded by their lifeless corpses. You will fail them all, Harry. In his mind he saw Ron's body, broken and bloody in front of the Weasleys' home which was burning to the ground. He tried to clear the image, but more bodies appeared before him. Hermione, Neville, and Tracy, all staring at him without eyes, reaching accusingly at him. Harry tried again to clear the nightmarish images, and then he saw Daphne. She was laying on the ground before him, covered in blood, eyes open wide in surprise and horror. She will die because of you, Harry. Voldemort's voice said to him. No. Harry screamed, and with all the strength he had in his body, brought the sword down onto the diadem, and halfway through Dumbledore's desk. There was a blast of magic, and an agonized scream that was near deafening. Black liquid poured from the two broken pieces of the diadem. Harry was panting heavily, still clutching the hilt of the sword, when he felt two very soft, gentle hands take a hold of his sweaty face. Harry? Harry, sweetie, it's okay. I'm okay. See? Daphne's voice was soft, and pleading. Nothing happened to me. I'm right here with you. It is all right, Harry. Dumbledore said calmly. It was the Horcrux's last defense, and you did not fall for it. Did you see it? Did you see what it showed me? Harry asked, finally letting go of the sword, and wrapping his arms around Daphne tightly. She only nodded as she held him to her. I tried telling you I was all right, but you couldn't hear me. Oh, Harry, that was just awful. It is all over now. Dumbledore said, inspecting the broken tiara. Another piece of Voldemort's soul has been destroyed. There are only 3 more left, and I believe I am very close to discovering another resting place. You two have had a very long day, and I see that we have all missed lunch. Dumbledore sighed as he took a seat at his desk. Quite a good cut, Harry. Dumbledore smiled at the teen, who looked a bit chagrined. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. Dumbledore waved it all off and smiled. A desk is easily repaired. Perhaps the two of you could make the best of the rest of the day, and try to take your minds off of what we have witnesses. I'm sure if you ask, Dobby would be most willing to provide you some sort of snack to tide you over until dinner time. Harry and Daphne smiled and bade the headmaster a good afternoon before making their way to the kitchens, where Dobby did indeed provide them with sandwiches. Neither of them spoke about all they had seen that day, even though it was pretty much all they could think about. Daphne didn't even bother mentioning her plan to Harry, as she didn't really want to go back into the room of requirement that night. Though she could make it into whatever she wanted, as she had learned early that morning, she knew she would feel dirty going back there so soon. Daphne awoke 3 days later on Christmas morning to a huge pile of presents at the foot of her bed. She smiled like a child as she began tearing into all her gifts. She was more than pleased with the new clothes and books from her parents, as well as the very stunning necklace. She received a very fashionable book bag from Tracy, as well as something she could not wait to try on, which she put aside. There was a silver bracelet from Neville, and a very fancy writing set from Hermione, with special inks and a small journal. Astoria had gotten her a locket with a picture of the two of them many years ago. Daphne was certain that Tori must have been about a year old when the picture was taken. It had come with a note from her younger sister that had made her eyes well up. Daphne. No matter how our lives will change, or where our paths will lead, I will always be there for you, just as you've been there for me. Love forever. Tori. She had saved Harry's present until last, and was very happy she had done so. The last time they had been in Hogsmeade, she had seen a jacket made of dragon hide, that she had fallen in love with. It had been very expensive, but she had simply not cared. The jacket was black and fit her as if it had been made for her. Daphne, mouth agape in shock, slipped the jacket on over her tank top, and closed her eyes in ecstasy at the feel of the enviable garment. She pulled it tight around her, and that was when she had noticed the small box in the pocket, pushing against her left breast. What she found simply took her breath away in an instant. She didn't think he'd even seen her looking at it. She'd thought she'd been so discreet, not wanting to frighten him, or make him feel obligated. She had simply seen it, and been entranced by its beauty. She hadn't even mentioned it, yet there it was in that tiny velvet box. The shining platinum band with the heart-cut emerald, with those two sparkling white diamonds to either side. Tears fell from her eyes as she slipped it onto her finger. He'd seen her looking at it, and somehow, when she wasn't looking, bought it for her. Daphne was so stunned, that she was having trouble breathing. It wasn't the ring, or the jacket that had her so floored. It was that he had observed, and remembered. He had always said he just wanted her happy, and she knew now, without a doubt, that he would spend every canute if that's what she wanted. Thankfully for the both of them, Daphne was not a materialistic woman, and if things went the way she envisioned them, Harry was going to learn exactly how to make her happy. Harry waited for his girlfriend in the entrance hall as was their custom. He couldn't help but smile as he wore his newest Weasley sweater, surprised for some reason that Mrs. Weasley would still think of him. Harry had already sent Hedwig off with a thank you note to the Weasleys for their gifts. The rest of his gifts had been quite good as well, and he had had an opportunity to speak with Sirius that morning. Harry had learned that he was not alone, as Amelia Bones' home had been attacked late the previous night. Both Amelia and Susan were perfectly fine, and were enjoying a very thankful Christmas with him, Remus and Tonks. Sirius went on to tell Harry that it was important that he not mention that the former interim minister was alive except to his friends, as the Death Eaters believed her dead. And it was an advantage the Order hoped to exploit as much as possible. Sirius told Harry that the Daily Prophet had reported Amelia and Susan's deaths, and that Susan would not be returning to Hogwarts, but would be receiving tutoring to prepare her for newts. Harry was relieved that Susan and Madame Bones were alive, but he felt worry for his friends and the hundreds of other families around Britain. Still, Harry knew they were expecting Madame Bones to be attacked. He simply wondered why it had taken so long. Harry was broken from his ponderings when Daphne arrived, dressed in jeans, black jumper, and the jacket he'd gotten her. Before he could say anything, she was in his arms, kissing him passionately. "You are truly amazing." She smiled when she broke their kiss. "How did you do it?" Harry shrugged. "While you were looking at those boots, I paid the man F, and had him mail it to me." Harry shrugged bashfully. "And this?" Daphne asked, holding up her right hand where she was wearing her new ring. "Yeah, Harry smiled nervously and ran a hand through his messy hair. "I kind of noticed you kept glancing at it while we were looking for Astoria's gift. It was either that or that rather atrocious-looking necklace in the same case. I took a chance. I am very lucky to have you, but I want you to know that these things aren't as important to me as you are, okay? I really love that you want to do things like this for me, but it isn't necessary." "I know." Harry nodded. "But I wanted to. Actually, I got the ring first, the jacket well, you kept talking about it to Tracy and Astoria and Hermione and Luna, and—" "All right, I get it." Daphne laughed, kissing Harry again. After breakfast, where Daphne learned of the attack on the Bones house, she was able to speak to her own parents with the two-way mirror that Sirius had provided her last summer. They thanked her for their gifts, and asked how well she was doing. They warned her to be very careful in the coming months. Daphne wanted to ask what they had heard, but neither her mother or father would speak any more on the matter. Harry and Daphne visited with Hagrid afterwards, and were treated to a few tales of his time as a student at Hogwarts as well as some more colorful stories from Hagrid's travels the previous summer. Hagrid felt, as they were both nearly 17, and in fact had been far more mature than most witches and wizards their age, they could handle such stories. The fact that Hagrid had already been through 2 bottles of mead before they arrived was likely a factor as well. Dinner was quite a subdued affair from Harry's previous experiences. All the teachers were present, save for Snape. Dumbledore handed out crackers to everyone, which turned into a variety of different hats. Dumbledore had traded his own pointed hat for a rather regal-looking top hat, while Professor McGonagall, who was giggling like a first year, was donning a very large pirate captain's hat, complete with skull and crossbones. In fact, Harry couldn't remember ever seeing the teachers quite so jovial. Harry guessed without Snape, the mood was somewhat cheerier. After dinner, Daphne led Harry to the 7th floor. Heart pounding in her chest, she paced in front of the room of requirement, picturing exactly what she needed. The door appeared, and Daphne took Harry's hand and led him inside. Harry was suddenly very nervous as he looked around at the intimate little room. There was a roaring fire in front of a very large bed. Harry gulped and looked to Daphne, who could not meet his eyes. She slipped away from him and went to sit on the bed. "I don't want to pressure you, or make you think I'm doing any of this because of your presence," she began. "I've thought about this for a very, very long time now. I'm not saying I'm ready to make love yet, but I'm not ruling anything out. I want to be closer to you, Harry. I've wanted to since. I know, and I'm sorry that we haven't had the chance. I'm just. Well, to be honest, I'm a little overwhelmed here. I didn't mean to spring this on you, I swear." Harry sat next to her and took her in his arms. "I know. Are you okay with this?" she asked, finally looking into his eyes, afraid of what she might see there. "I am," he answered honestly. "Just promise me that if you start to feel uncomfortable, or if we're going too fast, you'll say something." "I promise to do the same, all right." A broad smile came to her lips and she kissed him hard for a few minutes. She pulled away still smiling. "I'll be right back. I want you to see what Tracy got me for Christmas." She jumped up from the bed and ran through a door that Harry hadn't seen when he'd come in. While she was locked away, Harry took a few moments to take in the room. It was rather simple in its appointments, with just the bed and 2 tables on either side. The floor was wood, and quite shiny. The fireplace itself looked very familiar, and it took Harry a few minutes to realize that it resembled the one in Daphne's home. "What do you think?" Daphne asked from behind him. Harry turned, and felt as if his throat had clenched shut. Daphne stood before him wearing a very simple black slip with a green dragon embroidered on the left side. The straps were quite thin and the slip itself was cut quite low. It ended just as his thighs began, leaving barely anything to the imagination. Harry had not seen so much of Daphne since the summer in her bathing suit. Daphne couldn't help but shiver under Harry's gaze, and took a tentative step towards him. He looked as if he couldn't swallow, and his eyes were so huge, Daphne actually thought they might pop out of his skull. Somehow Harry's brain seemed to finally kick back into gear, and he closed the gap between them. The material felt so soft, and he guessed it might be made of silk. "I will personally thank Tracy when she gets back." Harry smiled. I think I will too. Daphne smiled, feeling like the most beautiful woman in the world under his gaze. She raised up on her tiptoes and began kissing him again, loving the way his arms felt around her slender waist. After a few minutes, Daphne broke their kiss, and led him back to the bed, where she pushed him down and climbed on top of him. Daphne was thrilled by the power she felt as she sat atop her boyfriend. She felt as if he was at her mercy, and smiled wickedly. "What?" he asked when he saw her look. "You're in my clutches, Potter." He laughed at her phony evil voice, and with a quick thrust of his hips, and a roll of his shoulder, Daphne found herself underneath him. Now who's in whose clutches? That wasn't fair. Daphne pouted, though it didn't reach her eyes, which were dancing merrily as she stared into Harry's smoldering green eyes. She pulled him down and kissed him again, wrapping her arms around his neck. Her body was on fire as he kissed her. It felt as if every nerve was tingling, and the sensation grew when Harry tore his lips from hers and began trailing kisses down her neck. Daphne brought her hands down to his waist and began slowly pulling his new jumper up his body. She wanted to be closer to him, with no barriers. She gasped in pleasure when his teeth grazed her collarbone. Daphne yanked hard on his shirt, and Harry pulled back and allowed her to remove his shirt altogether, before falling back onto her, and resuming to feast upon her flesh. Daphne's eyes were closed as she allowed herself to get lost in all the sensations Harry was giving her. His hands, however, remained firmly attached to her waist, while the rest of her body was aching to feel them elsewhere. "He's so damned noble," she screamed mentally. Realizing that he needed to know it was all right, she clasped left hand in her left, and began to move it up her body. She was thankful he didn't stop his ministrations on her shoulders and neck, but she wanted a bit more. She heard a small gasp of fright from him as she placed his hand upon her breast, and held it there. She took the opportunity and reached up as much as she could to kiss his bare chest. Daphne couldn't have asked for much better in a lover. Harry was very gentle, as he explored her breasts through the silken fabric of her negligee. He softly rubbed her chest, squeezing very gently. Daphne got a jolt of intense pleasure when his thumb rubbed over her nipple. "Do that again," she whispered in his ear. Harry complied at once, and Daphne shuddered, moaning ever so softly. Harry, emboldened by Daphne's groans of pleasure, ran his hands back down her body and up under her slip. Her skin was so soft and smooth. With every inch that Harry's hand climbed back up Daphne's bare torso, her breathing became increasingly heavier. Daphne couldn't believe that Harry was finally taking a bit of initiative. She had always loved the feel of his hands, but this was so much more, as there was nothing between them now. When Harry's hand ran up her left breast again, Daphne's back arched into his hand, her nipple stiffening under his palm. She wrapped her arms around his neck and drew him into a very deep kiss, putting everything she felt into it, hoping he would feel her desire and love for him. Months of frustration were washed away that night as they tentatively explore each other. Though it wasn't as far as Daphne was willing to go, especially as Harry did not even try to remove what little clothing she had on, she felt it was a success. And as they still had over a week left before everyone returned, Daphne did not feel rushed. After all, if Harry hadn't been so noble, and apparently just as frightened as she felt, he wouldn't be the man she loved. Still, now that she'd had a taste of what their relationship could be, Daphne craved more. Draco Malfoy had managed to find a cabin aboard the train back to Hogwarts away from the sycophants and the mudbloods, and especially his friends. He locked the door, and pulled the blinds so he would not be disturbed. He desperately needed the solitude. It had been the worst Christmas imaginable. He had never in all his life felt more terror, pain, and worst of all, humiliation than he had these past few weeks. He had spent his nights being tortured under the wand of his Dark Master, while he spent his days being nursed back to health only to be brought before the Dark Lord once again. It had all started the night he arrived home. The Dark Lord had demanded Draco be brought before him as soon as he flew in, and had already heard about the death of Millicent Bulstrode, as well as Draco's blundered attempt to kill Albus Dumbledore. The Master of the Dark had not been pleased at all. After the third day of torture and then being healed, Draco realized that he had become nothing more than his master's toy. No matter who brought the Dark Lord news of failure, Draco paid the price. Thankfully, the Dark Lord did not rely solely upon the Cruciatus curse. He enjoyed the snapping sound of Draco's bone being broken, or the terrible screams Draco made when the Dark Lord used some obscure pain hex upon the boy. Mostly, however, Voldemort seemed to enjoy making Draco's mother suffer, as she was forced to watch her only child writhe in agony and be unable to ease the pain. Nearly every night Draco caught glimpses of his mother staring in horror as he flailed upon the floor in unimaginable agony. At times, Draco wanted to call out to her, beg her to end his pain, but his pride always stopped him. His stupid, useless pride. Professor Snape was the one charged with tending to all of Draco's wounds, when the Dark Lord allowed him to be tended to. It appeared that Voldemort did not wish Draco to be permanently damaged, or bear any marks that would lead others to question what might have happened. Draco needed to look as if he had thoroughly enjoyed his holiday. Snape had tried several more times to gain Draco's trust, though now Draco feared that Snape was merely trying to trick him. Draco now believed it had been Snape who had reported his failings to the Dark Lord, and likely made stuff up to worsen the punishment. More and more Draco was growing to hate his head of house, as most of the rest of Hogwarts did, though for far different reasons. It was on the last day of holiday that Draco had the chance to actually speak with his mother, something he'd been wanting to do since he had come home. Narcissa came to check on him after another long night of suffering the ire of their master. She had come to his room before, simply watched him, and then left. Draco had never called out to her, as there had usually always been someone there. That morning he had been alone, and he called out for her to come closer to his bed. "Are you?" Narcissa began, her natural motherly instinct overriding her usual mask of stoic indifference. She managed to regain herself quickly, and asked with a tone of haughtiness. "Are you well?" "No more games, mother," Draco whispered. "Is it true that he doesn't think I will succeed? Our master would not have entrusted you to." "Do not think me a fool, mother. I'm no longer a child," Draco hissed angrily. Narcissa stared at her son hard for a moment before her mask broke once again, and she nodded slowly. Draco finally understood why she had always looked as if she did not care for anything. It was the Malfoy family mask. He had been trained from a very early age that he was superior to everyone else. A prince among wizards. Now, he was learning that it was nothing more than bravado. A falsity that, had there been no Dark Lord, might have carried him to very high levels of power in government, or whatever he wished. But now, it was broken, and Draco only wished to run and hide away from the Dark Lord and his new world order in which he would be nothing more than a slave. "You should never have joined his army. I never wanted this for you," Narcissa whispered. "We should leave. Now. This instant," Draco said, sitting up in his bed. "We'll go to the continent." Narcissa shook her head sadly. "We would never escape him. He would send his most cruel enforcers to find us, my son. We are locked too tightly into his service with no hope of escape." "You can't be serious. There has to be some place we could." "Don't think for a second that I wouldn't run away with you if I thought that we might be safe. I wanted to take you away from all this years ago, but your father would never allow it. He would find us, and he would make us suffer much worse than what you have experienced until now. Narcissa tore her left sleeve up to reveal the dark mark upon her forearm. This is more than a means to summon his faithful, Draco. He can find each and every one of us through this mark. Why else do you think he brands us with it? The only hope we have is that his enemies can somehow defeat him, or that you can find a way to succeed in your objective. Tell me, do you have a plan? She asked with hopeful eyes. Draco wanted to be confident, to say that he did indeed have a plan that would work, but looking into his mother's worried eyes, he felt all his bravado fail. Slowly, very slowly, he shook his head. Narcissa had to fight to choke down her sobs. She took a few deep breaths before she trusted her voice. Perhaps it is time that we swallow our pride, my son. Perhaps it is time that we sought help. She said nothing more, but stood, gave him a meaningful look and swept out of his bedroom, leaving him to ponder all she had said. He would have liked to ask her who he should seek assistance from, but they never had another moment to speak, not even when she dropped him off that morning to catch the train. He felt so exhausted, and his body still ached in places despite Snape's masterful ministrations to keep him healthy. Draco stretched out on the bench and wrapped himself in his heavy winter cloak. He'd been quite unable to stop shivering and his eyelids felt terribly heavy. Draco gave a yawn and allowed his eyes to close. He knew now that he had no choice but to do as the Dark Lord had ordered. He had to kill Albus Dumbledore, and he had to open Hogwarts to the Death Eaters. Controlling the school was tantamount to controlling the Ministry. To the Dark Lord, they were one in the same. Draco knew now that there was a timeline, and Draco was the primary cog in the Dark Lord's masterwork. Tonight he would try again to fix that accursed cabinet. If he could accomplish that, he would most assuredly come up with a way to end Dumbledore's life and save his mother's and his own lives. The last night was the very best. Daphne sighed, her eyes drifting into space. She was sitting with Tracy and Hermione in arithmancy class. They were supposed to be working on their assignment, but the three girls were reminiscing about their adventures over the holiday. At breakfast, Harry and Daphne had told their friends about the destruction of the Horcrux. Though Daphne had been dying to tell her two girlfriends something she felt was far more exhilarating than the destruction of yet another piece of the Dark Lord's soul. It was so wonderful to feel his skin on mine. I wanted to let go, and just shag him until neither of us could walk. Daphne sighed, though this time she sounded annoyed. Why didn't you? Tracy asked, totally engrossed in her friend's tale. He's too damned noble. Daphne sighed. Everything we did, I had to start. He just was so scared of hurting me, or taking things too far. I tried to let him know that it was okay, but I don't know. Hermione gave a soft smile. Be patient with him, and he'll come around. The only time he's ever acted on his urges is when it means helping someone else. He hasn't grasped the idea that sometimes it's okay to be a bit selfish. Just try not to let it get to you, and before you know it, you'll be together in your room, making love like. Hermione suddenly seemed to realize what she was saying, and felt her face burn scarlet. Both Tracy and Daphne turned to stare open-mouthed at their bushy-haired friend. Hermione bent low, focusing on her parchment. She didn't dare look at her two friends. Tracy could sniff out a secret like a damned bloodhound, and could make you spill your guts with a look. It was a gift, some would say, while Hermione, under that very gaze right in that moment, felt it should be classified as an unforgivable. Is there something incredibly saucy and delicious you'd really like to tell us? Tracy asked, unable to disguise the eager curiosity in her voice. Hermione shook her head, not daring to look at her friends. Oh my gods! Daphne whispered, her hand covering her mouth to keep from screaming. You and Neville. Shagged like puffskins in heat. Tracy said, leaning forward on her elbows, giving Hermione doe eyes, and a very wicked smile. Hermione looked up in horror at her friend's comments. Her eyes were bulging, her mouth hung agape in embarrassment. We did nothing as crass as that. Hermione tried to sound convincing, but her face gave away her guilt. You'd better start sharing with us, or we'll be forced to go speak to Neville, and we all know that he can't keep a secret to save his life. With the right amount of, shall we say, persuasion, he'll crack like an egg dropped on the floor. Tracy threatened. All right, Hermione said, fearful that Tracy would make good on her threat. She gave a cursory glance around the classroom to make sure they weren't being listened in on. It happened on Boxing Day. My parents went out to dinner, and Neville and I got to stay in the hotel room alone. I had just taken a shower and hadn't gotten dressed yet. I sat next to him on the bed wearing my bathrobe and we were watching something stupid on the telly. I kissed him, you know, just something soft, and he told me that he loved me. Well, we started kissing more and more, and I started feeling like I wanted him to touch me like he had done during the summer. Both girls nodded, hanging on Hermione's every word. The bookish Gryffindor tried to clear her throat before continuing. Truth was, it was actually nice sharing with her friends, despite how embarrassed she felt. He slipped his hands inside my robe, and I felt like I was on fire. I felt goosebumps all over, and I just had to get my hands on him. Hermione's face went even redder than before, which surprised her two friends, and they both thought that Hermione's head very nearly exploded. I nearly ripped his shirt off of him, Hermione admitted. Tracy looked like she was about to make a comment, but Daphne gave her a look to silence her blonde friend. Daphne knew that if either of them interrupted Hermione they wouldn't get any more details. I thought I had frightened him because he just stared at me for a second. I started to apologize when he started kissing me so passionately. I felt like I had lost control of myself. The more we kissed, the more I wanted. The more he touched me, the more I wanted to be touched. Everything became a blur of feelings and sensations. Hermione took a moment to catch her breath, as the memory of that night played in her mind. I know what you were saying before, Daphne, about feeling Harry's skin on yours. There are no words to describe what it felt like. When Neville was inside me, I don't know how else to say it. He was so gentle with me, and tender. He kept telling me how much he loved me, and how good it felt. And it truly did. It was the single most amazing thing I have ever experienced. When it was over, he just held me so tight, and ran his fingers through my hair. I have never felt so alive and content than when we made love. Each time was amazing. Exactly how many times did you and our Neville? Tracy began. 15. Hermione blushed again, looking back to her assignment. Daphne's eyes bugged out and she stared at Tracy, who was silently laughing. It's always the quiet ones, Tracy whispered through her giggles, which made Daphne break into silent laughter, and even Hermione, who was still blushing madly, chuckled a bit. Neville and Harry sat tucked away in a quiet corner in Gryffindor Tower. They both had a free period, which they were using to catch up while matching wits in a game of chess. The two boys had grown closer over the year, however, they had not really been given a chance to truly bond. How was skiing this year? Harry asked. Not bad, though I'm still rubbish at it. Actually, Hermione's dad took me golfing, and I really enjoy that. They have these little motorized carts to get around in, and Dan let me drive. It was really good fun. Neville smiled. Harry gave a chuckle. I take it Hermione's parents approve of you then. Neville suddenly blushed, and Harry gave an inquisitive look. They like me, but I'm afraid if they... Never mind. Neville said quickly, looking back to the chessboard. What is it? Harry asked. Neville looked around, and gave a sigh. You have to promise never to tell Hermione that I told you, but I need to talk to someone about it. Please understand, I'm not trying to brag, I don't have any guys I can just talk to about this sort of thing and not have it turn into something disgusting or something like that. What are you talking about? Neville once again looked around, making sure they weren't being overheard. Hermione and we took our relationship to that is. We. Spit it out already. Harry all but shouted. We made love. Harry felt like he'd been hit by a 1,000-pound bludger. Neville looked at him, waiting for his reaction. Oh. Harry finally said. I just sort of happened. It was truly amazing, and I love her so much, but I've been worried that we might have taken things too far, too fast. She seems okay with it all, but I'm afraid. I don't want to screw things up with her. Nev, Harry began, finally getting his head to function. Hermione is the most responsible, headstrong person I've ever met in my life. If she trusts you and cares for you enough to allow the two of you to, well then all you need to do is keep on caring for you as you've always have. Neville nodded, though he still looked worried. And, Nev, just so you know where I stand on the matter. What the two of you do is between you. But, if you ever hurt her, I will make you pay for it. Once she's done making you pay. Neville gave a very proud smile and nodded. Harry guessed that Neville just needed some sort of reassurance that he was doing right by the bushy-haired girl that they both held in such high esteem. How are things between you and Daphne? Harry felt himself blush a bit. Brilliant, though I think she would like to be where you and Hermione are. Just between the two of us, I'd like to as well, but I'm not about to make that move while we're in school. As it is, I'm worried that we're moving too fast. Are you worried, or are you afraid of going too far? Neville asked wisely. I know you would never intentionally hurt her, but I've watched you guys this year, and I have to tell you that you're kind of in danger of losing her. What do you mean? Harry looked up quickly. Daphne is an extremely patient and understanding person, Harry. But, she's also human, and just like anyone else, she needs to feel like she's special, especially to you. I know that you care for her. Neville said before Harry had the chance to argue. But with all your training and classes and everything else, you've hardly made time for her. To spend time with her. I've listened to her talk to Tracy and Hermione while you were in lessons, and I've got to tell you as a friend, that she needs some of your attention. It's almost like you're pushing her away by focusing so much on preparing to fight. I don't meant to, it's just that this is important. I'm the only one who can end all this. I know, Harry. Neville said. But if you forget to show her how much she means to you, you could lose her, and I don't want to see that happen. I'm not saying go find her and shag her rotten, like Seamus would tell you. I get it, Neville. Harry said, stopping his friend. And I think she made it clear to me over holiday. We well, we didn't get quite as intimate as you and Hermione, but I don't need details. Neville smiled. But I'm happy for you. Harry nodded, and the two returned to their chess match, though Harry could no longer focus. He kept thinking to how it felt to hold Daphne's nearly naked body so close to his own, and how hot her flesh felt upon his own as they explored each other's flesh with their hands and their mouths. He'd been so hesitant, but the more he tasted of Daphne, the more he wanted. Still he was afraid. Afraid of hurting her, or being unable to control himself. Afraid of what it might mean if his enemies learned just how much he felt for Daphne. Afraid of her rejecting him or leaving him. He had never in all his life felt anything like what he felt just being next to her, and what frightened him the most was losing that. "Hey Harry." "Ginny." Harry smiled as he greeted the young redhead. "How are you?" "I'm good. Thank you. Do you have a minute?" "I can go get." Neville started, but Ginny shook her head. "You don't have to go anywhere, Neville. I just wanted to let Harry know that he needs to be careful." "What do you mean?" Harry asked. Ginny gave a soft smile and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "I overheard some girls on the train coming back yesterday. It seems there are quite a few girls who don't like the fact that you're with Daphne, and they think it's time you two broke up and gave some other girls a chance at you." "What?" Harry asked, eyes bulging out of his head. Neville began to snicker. "Hermione heard some girls on the train at the start of holiday coming up with ideas to ensnare you." "Ensnare me?" "Hermione's words, not mine, mate," Levi said, holding his hands up. "The point is that you should watch your back. There's a fourth-year girl named Romilda Vane, and she seems convinced that you and her will be together before the end of the year. I wouldn't put it past her to use one of Fred and George's love potions on you." Ginny grinned, and Harry had to smile in return. One thing Ginny had always been great at was lightening the mood, not unlike Ron. Harry suddenly felt very guilty for more or less ignoring her all year. "So, you're saying I should watch what I eat and drink?" Harry quipped. "I would." "Thanks, Ginny. And I'm sorry that we haven't spoken or anything. I just..." "Forget it, Harry. Let's just let the past remain in the past. I didn't make any attempt to speak to you either, so we're both gigantic gits." Harry nodded, and smiled as Ginny rose from her seat. "I've got to get back to studying." "Why didn't any of you prats tell me our year was so horrendous?" "Ginny," Neville called as the redhead started moving away. "What house are these girls in? Should Harry be watching out for any house in particular?" "All of them really. That Romilda girl is a Gryffindor." Harry suddenly felt like a hunted animal. He had no idea that he was so popular, though as he thought about it, it was very likely none of these girls cared a lick about Harry, but were after the boy who lived. Or knew that he was quite wealthy, or some other shallow reason. Harry breathed a sigh as he thought of the girl he was with. Daphne truly cared about him as a person. So much so she had come to his aunt and uncle's home to literally beat some sense into him. Harry seriously doubted most of the other girls in the school would do that. Harry considered himself very blessed, and now he intended to show Daphne exactly how much he appreciated her. Maybe they could skip dinner and sequester themselves in the room of requirement for a few hours. Lord Voldemort sat with a heavy mind. He stared at his wand, lost in thought over his plans and his diminishing power. He was beginning to wonder if he would have the power to rule over the wizarding world when he finally managed to take it for himself. Once again, he had felt another significant drop in his magic 3 days before Christmas. He was still able to cast most of his favorite spells, and had used young Malfoy to test his abilities, as he was afraid one of his other followers might feel the difference in power. Or think him merciful. His research had turned up nothing, and the Dark Lord was actually starting to feel anxious about his fate. He could of course, not die, but was it possible to lose all of his magic? To become nothing better than a muggle? He could not find any answers, and it was disturbing him most grievously. His research had failed him. It seemed there was no precedent for this sort of occurrence, so he would need to try to solve the problem himself. His first thought was to somehow replace Potter's blood with another wizard's, preferably with someone very powerful, like that crazy old muggle-loving fool, Dumbledore. Voldemort actually chuckled at that thought. Even if he hadn't ordered the old fool killed, he knew it would be impossible to get his blood. None of his Death Eaters could match Dumbledore's power, or his creative spell work. Then the idea came to him. His plans were moving quickly, and soon he was going to have access to a wealth of powerful witches and wizards, many of them purebloods. A very sinister smile began spreading on his lipless face as Lord Voldemort imagined all the young faces staring up at him in awe as he strode into the great hall, pronouncing his victory. Then, he could meet with each and every child and drain the most powerful of their life, and infuse their magic to his own. And of those left alive, he would begin their education of his brave new world, where wizards ruled over muggles. But before any of that would come to pass, there was one thing that had to be addressed, and it had to be done in front of the whole of Hogwarts, and the magical world together. Harry Potter would die at last. He's placed other within the castle, Severus Snape said wearily. He sat in Dumbledore's office, nursing his third glass of brandy, while Dumbledore listened to his defense teacher's report of the happenings over the holiday. I don't know how many, or even who they might be, but I do know that Draco is not the only one. From what I could gather, they're in place should Draco fail, or be found out. Dumbledore took a deep breath and swallowed the last of his tea. He set the empty cup down and sighed deeply. Were you able to convince Draco to give up his task? The elder man asked. Snape shook his head. After all that boy suffered through, he still refused to listen to me. He's so much like his father. Do you have any idea of what he's trying to do? Other than end your life? Snape snorted. No, I do know that the Dark Lord's pulling all his followers in and preparing for something big, though I was not informed of what his plans are. He only told me to prepare myself, and that triumph was near. His failure to kill Amelia Bones and her niece no doubt irritated him. Snape sat up and gave the older man a strange look. In fact it did. Snape said, rising to his feet. I don't know why it didn't occur to me then, but something strange happened when he heard about that. He punished Draco for Rodolphus' failure. In fact, Draco suffered for nearly every transgression committed by other people. That's unusual. Dumbledore said, steepling his fingers. Do you have an opinion on it? I'm not sure. Snape shrugged slightly. Draco had never been tortured by the Dark Lord before, and he didn't rely on the Cruciatus curse. In fact, he used a lot of very simple spells. Bone breakers and the like. It was almost as if he were losing his power. Dumbledore stood up. It's working. What are you talking about? With every Horcrux that is destroyed, Voldemort loses some of his power. By the time they are all destroyed, and Harry faces him, they should be on equal ground, perhaps a bit more in favor of Harry. It was one of my theories regarding the Horcruxes. It seems that I may have been correct. And what if he figures out why he's losing his strength? Snape asked, a worried expression on his sallow face. If he believes that his Horcruxes have been destroyed, he will retrieve the remaining ones, and hide them, and we shall have no hope of finding them, and Lord Voldemort will win this war. Snape winced at the thought of Voldemort's plans succeeding. Do you have any ideas on where the rest are? I am nearly positive that one of them resides with Gringotts. Just as Lucius possessed one, I believe that he entrusted another with one with instructions to place it in their family vault. It would have been someone from a very old family, so the vault would be in the very deepest part of the Goblin Bank. That narrows the field down a bit. Other than Malfoy, there would only be the Blacks, the Rookwods, the Carrows, the Lestranges, and the Averys. Of those, I believe only Bellatrix would have been so trusted. That seems most likely. The goblins of course will not allow us into someone else's vault without a reason, as well as suitable compensation. Dumbledore sat down again, bringing his hands together once again. Another you have seen many times. His familiar. Nagini is a Horcrux? How is that possible? How could he place a piece of his soul inside something that already had a soul? He did it with Harry. That was some sort of cosmic joke. You told me yourself that the object needed to be prepared to receive the bit of soul. A snake would be far easier to contain and keep in one place during such a ceremony. Regardless, he has an unprecedented amount of control over the snake. I believe it is a Horcrux. The last one is hidden near the shore. I am very close to discovering its resting place, and when I do, I will take Harry and we shall destroy it. The snake will be the very last one to be destroyed, and I wish for you to see that it is. Me. Snape turned to stare at Dumbledore as if he'd grown another head out of his chest. You will know when the time comes. We must do our very best to keep Lord Voldemort from discovering what we are doing. I have taken steps to guide Harry after I am gone so that he will not try and take on Lord Voldemort until he is absolutely ready to end Lord Voldemort once and for all. Dumbledore sighed. You're asking so much of me. Snape glared. First you want it to be me who ends your life, incidentally making me a wanted man with no way for me to prove that it was you who asked me, and now you want me to finish off your quest. And I have to figure out when the correct time is. Severus, there is someone who would stand up for you if you would just stop. Snape snapped. I have asked you over and over again to drop this. I am not going to confess myself to Potter. I desire neither his respect, his friendship, or even his pity. My sins, and the reason for them will die with me. Snape gave one last glare and swept from Dumbledore's office, leaving the headmaster to ponder why Severus Snape held so tightly to his anger and hatred. At least I can count on him to do what must be done. Dumbledore thought as he rose from his desk and prepared himself for bed. Please like and subscribe.